What's up, traders, and welcome back to another YouTube video. On today's video, I'm just going to talk about step index and what my expectation is in the specific asset going forward. Now, if you're familiar with step index, it's found on the broker deriv and basically binary.com, and it's just one of the indices that they do offer. Now, this is a chart that I have been looking at for quite a while, and it is in some significant areas where I'm expecting some big moves to come out of. And as a result of that, I said, let me just share this with you guys. Before I get into the video, remember I am not licensed nor qualified to offer financial, investment, or trading advice. Everything I speak about on these videos is purely my own opinion. I do not recommend trading live capital, but if you do so, do it with capital that you are willing to risk or lose. And also ensure that you do your own research, ensure that you do your own analysis so that when price is moving in your favor, you know how to manage it. When price is moving against you, you know how to manage it as well. So getting straight into it, I'm just going to start on the weekly time frame, and this is not going to be a very long video. There are going to be things that you're going to see on my chart that I'm not going to speak about. If you're familiar with them, you might understand what they are. Um, that doesn't necessarily mean that my application is the same, right? But if you're unfamiliar with them, just ignore them, right? I will give you um, other things that I am looking at that I'm willing to get into. So looking at the weekly time frame on step index, we can very clearly see that we are in a downtrend, right? Price is making lower low, lower high, lower low, lower high, lower low, and now it's either going to make a lower high in this area and move lower, right? Or it's going to form a pullback, right? A pullback perhaps to come and form a higher low in this area here before it begins to move up, right? Whatever happens at the moment, as far as I'm concerned, this is a overbought market, and I am expecting some sort of a retracement. Now, why am I expecting that retracement? If we look into this last bearish leg that we can see over here, in this last bearish leg, we can very clearly see that, okay, there was an increase in momentum after price traded up, right? And it traded above this high in here, right? Traded above that high and then it came back and it broke structure to the downside in here. What we can see is an increase in bearish momentum coming out of that area. So look at the size of those bearish candles compared to these previous candles in here, right? So price was showing like it was losing momentum. It formed a pretty strong area of quote unquote support in this area, gave us a nice reaction off of that area to the bullish side, but still came back and smashed straight through to the downside, right? So this increase in momentum in here is telling me that, okay, there's still some sort of commitment for price to go to the downside. Now, those that have been in my group and so forth will understand that I call this a recommitment, right? And this is just telling me that there's a recommitment to the trend moving to the downside, as it did show signs of wanting to change in this area, even going as far as to breaking above this high. But once it then came back and increased in momentum and smashed to the downside, it showed a recommitment to the downside. So what we can do as a result of that is, I mean, if we're looking at support and resistance, right, um, we can say that, okay, I have a very um, different way of looking at support and resistance. I would simply look at this area here as my area of resistance or support, sorry, that would become resistance when price comes back into it, right? Um, And what we can see right now is that price has retraced back into this area of quote unquote resistance, support turned resistance as a result of this momentum break to the downside. So that is an area where we can expect to see some downside. So when we drop down to the lower time frame, we can begin to look for bearish signs, bearish confirmations in this area. Now, if you're a pattern trader, if you look at patterns and so forth, the things that I would look at in this area is your double tops, your head and shoulders, and so forth. These are the things that I would expect to see happening inside of this area as a confirmation that this trend is then willing to change, right? This market is responding, or price is responding to the specific area that I am looking at. Another thing that we could look at in this area is because we have a nice structure break to the downside. We've got a oh wow because we have a nice structure break to the downside, we have in this area here a lower high, which has already created a lower low. So once I have what I call a confirmed and validated structure level, I can then grab a Fibonacci and I can pull it on that. So if I'm looking at from high to low, because it is a bearish swing, that is where I will grab my fib from the high down into the low, and I would look for specific areas. Now you can see on my fib, I have specific areas marked up, and this is entry. This is marked as entry 2. This is basically where I would look for my first entry. You can see that price came and reacted to it and pushed quite significantly to the downside. So this was a trade opportunity. Unfortunately, I wasn't looking at this chart at this time, so I did not necessarily take advantage of that move. Um, Price then reacted and came back, broke this high back to the upside. So is this not a similar pattern as to what we saw happening here, right? So price came, reacted, came back to the upside. So here, that's the same thing, came back to the upside. And then what did it do? It smashed to the downside. So at minimum, I can expect to see price doing what? Breaking this low and coming back perhaps into this area in here. But for safety, what I normally would do is I would target the previous low. So that would be essentially where I would look to take profits. So we can see that this is a very similar pattern as to what we saw happening in this area here. So we might expect the same thing to happen in this area over here. So looking at that now, price is approaching what I call entry 2, which is basically the 79% fib, and this is the 62% fib. This here is basically the 50% fib, right? So I just renamed it because I don't necessarily need all of that other stuff, and just to sort of remind myself what that is. So entry 2 is right here. This is basically a confirmation entry, and once price taps into that area, it really, really is a good catalyst for the fact that price is inside of this area of what I would call support turned resistance, right? So the fact that price is inside of this area, I would then expect to see some sort of downside coming from that. Now, this pink zone is unfortunately something I'm not going to discuss on this video. Ultimately, this is the highest point that I would expect price to come to before that push to the downside if I get that. But price doesn't always come into this area, but this would basically be a very high quality trade that I would look to take if price gets into that area. But this zone right in here is good enough for me to look. If I get the appropriate confirmations inside of there, that is essentially where I'm going to look. So I say all of that to say that out of this area in here, I am looking for sell to the downside. Back to TP1 would be at this area here, and TP2 would obviously be at the previous low down in here. I would obviously get out before this previous low, but also that is something that I'm not going to discuss as it is part of my exit criteria. So I'm going to take that off. In fact, I'm not going to take that off. It doesn't show on my lower time frame. So I'll take that information and I now drop down to the 4-hour time frame. Now, on the 4-hour time frame, I'm looking for sells, right? I'm looking for sells, but I have to see signs that price is starting to move over to the downside. Now, at the moment, I can very clearly see that we are in a bullish trend on the 4-hour time frame. I have to see the 4-hour time frame convert to a evidence or signs that it is beginning to move to the downside. So what I can see right now is still very bullish. We've got a high, we've got a high low, we've got a break, got a high low, we've got a break, got a high low, we've got a break, or you could call this the high low. We've got that as a break, right? So I can very clearly see that price is still quite bullish and there is no reason for me to be taking sells at the moment. But what we can see right now is we can also see that, hey, we've got what could be a left shoulder in here. We can wait for the head to form, and provided that that head breaks the neckline, which would then be the first sign. Why? Because then price would break structure at this point and it would create a lower low at that point. So the creation of that head and shoulders would also be a confirmation that the trend is changing as well to the downside. So this is one of the first things that I would need to see happening in here. And once I see that beginning to happen, I will then start to take advantage of those sells to the downside. Once price retraces into an area of significance, I'd probably still use the fib. Then I'd take the fib from that high down into this low. I would look for that entry one and entry two, and then I'd look for that sell back to the downside from around there. If you're looking at chart patterns and stuff like that, you could still look at your chart patterns, your ascending chart patterns, descending chart patterns. Obviously, in this case right now, we can very clearly see what, if we pan out a bit out of this market, we can very clearly see that, hey, there was a takeoff from this area. In fact, let me actually take it from right from the weekly low. So we've got our first high low formed in there. I also have a very strange way of drawing my trend lines as well. So I'll take a trend line from there up into that area here. And you can see that the method that I use to draw my trend line actually works quite well, because you can see on the third tab price took off, right? So with the trend line right now, what would I do? What would I do? What would I do? Okay, from here, I can take a trend line from this low up, and where's my next high low? It's here. So we can actually see, what we can see is we have a breakout of the trend line at this point already. So price has already broken below the trend line, and my next expectation would be to see it reach this trend line. Perhaps we could get a retest, so a break and a retest into this trend line, so perhaps somewhere up in here is something that I could look for. Price perhaps somewhere up in this area here, and take that down into there. Then I would have a break of structure here, and then I can begin to look for that confirmation setup that I've just spoken about as well. So very, very strange way of looking at trend lines. I might perhaps do a video on this at some point. I haven't necessarily covered it on the channel. I don't necessarily use it that actively either, but it is a very, very precise way of looking at trend lines based on structure, as opposed to just, spitballing what a trend line is, which low you're going to take and which high you're going to take. There's significance behind the lows and the highs that I do take. So looking at the 30-minute now, on the 4-hour, we can clearly see that, hey, price is showing signs of, some short-term downside. Price is in a significant area, so we should see some short-term sells coming into the market until such a time as we see a break of structure on the 4-hour, and then we can begin to take those long-term sells to the downside. So what I would generally do is I'd generally drop down to the lower time frame and take advantage of those lower time frame sells to the downside. So what do I see on the 30-minute? On the 30-minute chart, I can see that, hey, price came up into this high, created a high, created a higher low, created a higher high, and then at this point it broke structure to the downside. So the fact that it broke structure to the downside in here tells me, hey, I might get an opportunity to get a sell if price does pull back, right? So what I'm currently looking for is I'm currently looking to see if I can get a low formed in this area. If I get a low, that would then be my lower low. That would be my higher high. Then I would expect to see a lower high, right, which would at least come back into this low, right? So price comes up, which would at least come back into this low or proceed lower to make another low. Now, I'm not too attached to this happening. I'm simply looking for that lower high to give me to get back into this previous low in here. That would basically be my trade opportunity. Why would that be my trade opportunity? Because I'm not sure if the trend is going to change. So for me to then enforce my assumption on the market and say, hey, it's going to provide a lower low, I can't necessarily do that because I have no evidence of that happening yet, right? But if I get a lower high, at minimum, I can expect it to reach back into the previous low at around this area in here, right? Now you can see that price is reacting to this zone that I've got on this market, and I was expecting to see some upside coming out of that zone. And I'm simply waiting for price to now pull back into this range, right? And then I'm looking for that short-term sell into here. So that's it for this chart for now. I'll probably do some follow-ups on the charts that I've covered both yesterday and today, and I'll just keep on updating as they do progress. Until next time, it has been a pleasure, as always, to share with you guys, and I am wishing you a blessed and a profitable remainder to the trading week. Catch up again soon.